In the past 2 days, we have discussed some historical issues of Russia and the Soviet Union. Regarding the characteristics of Russia as a country, there is an important concept that needs to be clarified, that is, how is the Soviet, a grassroots political form that has long been of great significance in Russian history, evolved in history, what kind of influence it played in different periods, especially in the history of the Soviet Union. This issue has published an article on this issue before, and I will repost it today for readers' reference and discussion. In 2023, 32 years have passed since the disintegration of the Soviet Union. In 1991, the towering building that fell suddenly shocked most people on the earth at that time. 32 years have passed, and the aftermath has not dissipated. Whether it is the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan in the South Caucasus in 2020 or the big military performance on the border between Russia and Ukraine in 2022, until the war between Russia and Ukraine in 2022, reminds people of the behemoths of the past. All kinds of debates have never stopped, whether it is the nostalgia and sigh of today's various geopolitical conflicts if it had not disintegrated back then, and the accusation and criticism that today's troubles are the bane left by the Soviet Union. Of course, it is more of a reflection on the history of the Soviet Union. Why the Soviet Union was born and why it died still sparks constant debate. Of course, with the passage of time, this kind of debate has also begun to diversify, gradually no longer limited to the traditional view of party history and the view of party history that was born on this basis in the 1970s and 1980s and prevailed in the 1990s. Instead, it re-examines and analyzes many historical details that have not been brought into view in the past, and establishes a new framework for historical views on this basis. Today, let's talk about a concept that has been put on the bright side in the past, but has been shrouded in layers of halo so that it has not been properly understood. That's the question of what a Soviet is. This article has enough dry goods, the full text is more than 15,000 words, please read it patiently. The Soviet before the Soviet. Many people may be surprised that the concept of Soviet is familiar to those who have a little understanding of politics and Russian history. It is a very clear thing. The Soviet Union itself is the official name of the Union of Soviet Socialist States. It is enough to understand the concepts of political science, so what is there to discuss? Of course, because it is too familiar, many people will ignore its own meaning, so here is a reference to Baidu Encyclopedia's understanding of the word Soviet. Soviet, which means representative conference or committee in Russian, refers to the organizational form created by the Russian proletariat during the 1905 revolution to lead the masses to carry out revolutionary struggles. A democratic form, whose representatives can be elected and replaced at any time, implies a Paris Commune-style form of power. After the October Revolution, Soviets became the symbol of a new type of regime in Russia. The most basic production units in cities and villages had Soviets. Under the leadership of the Communist Party, the Soviets could not only legislate, but also directly derive administrative agencies. But if you look at the explanation of the word Soviet, in Russian, in addition to the above explanations, there are other meanings such as consultative conferences, collective organizations, any equal rights representatives discussing consultation institutions, can be called Soviets, such as the Russian language of the United Nations Security Council it is called, that is, the United Nations Security Soviet. Of course, this translation must be extremely harsh to the Chinese. In order to prevent the confusion of political concepts, Soviet is a specific translated term in China. This is undoubtedly correct. On the other hand, it also leads to a misplaced understanding of many concepts in the history and politics of Soviet Russia. Why entangle this concept? Because without clarifying the concept, it is impossible to go deep into the details. Now that we know the meaning of Soviet, is a kind of consultative meeting, then the next level of explanation in Baidu Encyclopedia, that is, the Soviet as an organizational form, originated from the 1905 revolution, this statement is very problematic. For example, the House of Lords of the Russian Empire, which originated in 1810, was also translated as the Council of State. In Russian, it is also called, which can also be translated as the National Soviet. It cannot be said that the Russian Revolution 100 years later affected 100 people through time and space. Was it the establishment of Tsarist Russian state institutions years ago? So since the two sides that are diametrically opposed to each other both use the Soviet, as their main leadership and organizational form, a reasonable inference is that this concept has a longer, more popular and even more representative source. In recent years, Russian historians and political commentators have paid a lot of attention to and discussed the tradition of self-government since ancient Russia. The summed up self-government/consultation organizations of various classes and different eras include the Citizens' Assembly, Vich, the Boyar Noble Council, Duma, and the National Alliance of Powerful Factions, Gentlemen's Assembly. Among all these autonomous organizations, the lowest level, and the closest to ordinary people, is the Soviet. Of course, the biggest feature of this kind of Russian self-government organization is that it has the functions of legislation, law enforcement, and administration at the same time, rather than simply a place for empty talk and discussion. Town Assembly in Nizhny Novgorod, painting. It is beyond the scope of this article to discuss the Russian self-government tradition in detail. Here we only focus on matters related to the Soviets. Although it has always been the lowest self-government institution, the Soviets have also shined brilliantly in Russian history and rebuilt rivers and mountains. This history has been hidden behind many details in the past, but it has received more attention in recent years. At the beginning of the 17th century, Russia was experiencing the darkest moment in its history, also known as the Age of Chaos. There is no legal Tsar in the country, the State Duma controlled by the Moscow boyar nobles, the citizens' assemblies in various places that follow the footsteps of the State Duma, and the long-lost gentry assembly are all discredited and have lost their legitimacy in the eyes of ordinary people. It has even become synonymous with villains and traitors. In 1611, the volunteer army known as the First Militia approached Moscow. Because they were unwilling to accept the order of the Boyar Duma, who was regarded as a traitor, representatives of 25 cities signed an agreement to establish the Soviet of the whole land, as the highest authority to issue conscription orders to various places. Of course, the First Militia soon did not do much because of internal chaos and the resistance of many cities to this institution. But in the second year, the 2nd Militia Regiment born in Nizhny Novgorod received more support. Representatives from all walks of life from all over Russia established the Soviet of the whole land, and for the first time renamed the Principality of Moscow to the State of Russia, declaring that they will go to the national disaster together and rebuild the state system. In the same year, the 2nd Militia Regiment defeated the Polish occupying forces and successfully liberated Moscow. The 2nd Militia Regiment is blessed by the Bishop of the Holy Trinity Church. So why did the Soviet of the All Lands, which played such a role, become unknown in later history and was almost ignored? This is largely due to the weakness of similar institutions, such as equal consultation. It sounds wonderful, but once important issues are encountered, decisions cannot be made quickly because of equal rights for everyone, and it is difficult to ensure the correctness of decisions. This will happen again and again in future history. This is why the ancient Rus city-state, which has a long tradition of self-government, has to continuously invite foreign Grand Dukes and later Tsars as leaders, also because of the need to patch the system. Of course, this political form in which unitary dictatorship and autonomous organizations coexist, and the interaction, compromise, and struggle between them constitute Russia's unique endogenous forces and tensions. After the Polish occupying forces were expelled from Moscow, the most important thing before various forces was to elect a new Tsar as soon as possible. The retainers, who are not the leaders of the militia regiment, and because they are part-time soldiers, cannot stay in Moscow for a long time. In this case, in the comparison of strengths, the boyar nobles of Shiking-Shalu occupy a more favorable position, especially the boyar nobles have attracted some professional troops, Cossacks, of the 1st Militia Regiment, and in the name of convening a wider range of representatives to participate in the discussion of state affairs, a meeting of nobles and gentry was held to elect the emperor. Then, to a considerable extent, the Soviet representatives of the whole country who stayed in Moscow became the representatives of the General Assembly of Gentlemen. This is quite a status boost for the former. As mentioned earlier, the Soviet is a very low-level autonomous organization, while the General Assembly of Gentlemen is a serious ruling class. In fact, this period of history can highlight the class limitations and insensitivity to political struggles of peasants and petty bourgeoisie. Nahi Budain, like the Romanov dynasty, also kept this matter secret. This is also the place where many people felt inexplicable when they looked at this period of Russian history. How could small citizens, merchants, and peasants send representatives to elect the emperor together? Even doubting its authenticity, the actual situation is that the election of the emperor was the merger of two organizations. Later, in order to promote its legitimacy, the Romanov family has always emphasized that the representatives of the Emperor Election Conference have a wide range of sources, so they represent the opinions of all subjects, but they do not mention the Soviets of the whole land, but blindly confuse it with the Gentry Conference. Not only ordinary people can't understand it, but even many professional historians have been arguing for many years about whether there are lower-level representatives in the General Assembly of Gentlemen. It is precisely because the sources of the members of the Emperor Election Conference are complicated, and the various interests and demands are completely different. In the end, all the candidates who personally ended up wanting to recommend themselves were all sacked. When the news came, their mother and son were so frightened that they hid in the monastery and refused to come out. After the establishment of the Romanov dynasty, the main line of Russia's political process was to strengthen centralization, but don't be fooled by the term enhancing centralization. To be precise, it relatively strengthened centralization. At the same time, due to insufficient actual control, or it is said that even after the establishment of the dictatorial monarchy system at the central level, the tradition of local autonomy in Russia has not disappeared at the same time, but it has lost the institutional voice and interest appeal channels at the central level. From the first Tsar Mikhail sharing the world with the Assembly of Gentlemen, to his son Alexei's substantial cancellation of the Assembly of Gentlemen, and then to his grandson Fedor's abolition of the status of nobles. On the one hand, it seems that the absolute imperial power has an advantage in the design of the central system, but once there is a change in the central government, such as Fedor's untimely death and the eldest Princess Sophia's ruling, the first thing to do is to hold the gentry meeting again, in order to establish the legitimacy of their regency. Then when Catherine II came to power in the coup d'état, the jurisprudence was also a mess and lacked any basis. She sent representatives from all over the country to the capital to discuss legal issues. In fact, it can also be regarded as a shrunken version of the General Assembly of Gentlemen, thus establishing its status. Legality. Then the General Assembly of Gentlemen, which was the original source of legitimacy of the imperial power, has become an institution that can come and go as soon as it is called. The boyar nobles who have been cancelled, don't make the Duma or something to block the Tsar. Also change the name and downgrade. What name? It was renamed the Soviet, and the Supreme Privy Council established in 1726 was called in Russian, the Supreme Secret Soviet. Then this is the source of the change of the word Soviet in the top-level building, and there is another evolution route besides the top-level changes. The Soviets at the bottom of society, as an autonomous organization, did not disappear with the establishment of the Romanov dynasty. Although the second militia was divided and suppressed politically, even the national heroes Minin and Brzezinski were not passed down as nobles. However, the grassroots Soviet organizations that are originally at the bottom still have the vitality of weeds. Whether it is the elders meeting at the rural commune level, that is, the Soviet of the elders, or the mutual aid organizations formed when they went out to do business and work, they have a lot of influence in the dark. The various unofficial church factions in Russia also formed self-governing institutions such as Soviets to manage internal affairs and strive for external interests to defend themselves, thus forming an undercurrent under the calm surface of Tsarist Russian society. Of course, the Soviets are not a unified organization, but regions, people, churches, and enterprises in need often establish themselves spontaneously, or join existing similar organizations. If you make a simple comparison, the Chinese people can understand it best, and the closer concept is the meaning of gangs and parties. Bronze statue of Minin and Brzezinski on Red Square in Moscow. Russian Revolution and the Soviets. In fact, when it comes to the Russian Revolution in the 20th century, it is a two-level process, which overlaps with each other, but they should not be confused. One level is the revolution of the powerful and the big bourgeoisie, that is, the nobles hope to regain the privileges that their ancestors have had, which were seized by the Tsar. Of course, this process began at the beginning of the 19th century. You have to understand that in terms of blood, our family is more qualified to be called the Tsar. After the 20th century, the emerging Tsarist Russian native big bourgeoisie joined the process, also hoping to limit imperial power and solidify their own privileges. The other is the revolution at the bottom, that is, the revolution of the peasants and workers. Often confusing the two is also a major misunderstanding when looking at the historical issues of Soviet Russia. Then the former, that is, the revolution of the rich and powerful, requires the reconvening of the Duma, parliament, and a responsible government controlled by the parliament. Why is there such a requirement? You can recall the beginning of this article. Russia's self-government institutions are the trinity of legislation, law enforcement, and administration. In essence, he conflicts with the Western concept of separation of powers. Although the same set of political terms can be used to describe it, there is actually a big difference. Similarly, Japan, another country that had a lot of fun in modern constitutional discussions, did not have the almost pathological pursuit of a responsible government controlled by parliament. Of course, on the one hand, we know that Ito Hirobumi's work on the Japanese constitution and parliament is to learn from Germany, but on the other hand, the set of things he made is not much different from the collegial meeting of the samurai ministers in Japanese history. Similarly, other East Asian countries follow the trend of shouting about the Constitutional Assembly, and let it go as if the wind has passed. The Russian grassroots revolution that began in 1905, under the traditional view of party history, was intellectuals who accepted advanced Western ideas, went to the people and inspired them. At the same time, under the influence of the Paris Commune in France, Soviet organizations were established. However, this kind of statement is difficult to be confirmed in the history after the 20th century. That is to say, symbols, concepts, and theories in cross-cultural circles have poor acceptance and appeal when they are disseminated, and it takes a very long time. It takes hard work to bear fruit. For example, when the same revolutionary thought was spread to India, there was a saying that the reincarnated soul boy led us to victory in the revolution, and in Africa, a revolutionary party engaged in black magic was born. If it is said that there have been decades of hard work, there is another question, that is, what is the cultural and educational level and literacy rate of the Tsarist Russian Empire? Now we all know that after receiving a complete higher education in the late 20th century and early 21st century, the details of ideology and theory that most people can't figure out, if it can be generally accepted by the poor in Russia at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, this is either Tsarist Russian education the level breaks through the sky, or there is a huge problem in the narrative. If it is admitted that the Soviets, as Russia's long-standing non-government autonomous organizations, have great prestige and mobilization capabilities, the intellectuals who have been influenced by Western revolutionary ideas only join them because of their similarities in ideas and the fact that this kind of self-government organization the threshold is quite low, and you can come and go freely, so you can join it and promote your ideas through its organization. According to this joint occupation theory, quite a lot of historical context after the February Revolution can be clearer and more reasonable, rather than a black and white film with constantly jumping shots due to being cut. In fact, it is not surprising to say that this kind of grouping is not surprising, and it can even be said to be more reasonable. For example, before the Revolution of 1911 in China, especially after the Revolution of 1911, the party was the main force participating in the Chinese Revolution, and it was not until the late 1930s that the low tide is also a combination and collision of foreign ideas and local traditional organizations and concepts. However, in the Russian Revolution narratives in the past, there was no description of the localization process at all. Everything was explained by Lenin's genius and the unparalleled appeal of the International Revolution. The Soviet Union died joke came out. Then, under this new framework, we briefly review the history of the Russian Revolution after the February Revolution in 1917. As mentioned earlier, the February Revolution was actually carried out at two levels. One was a coup and mutiny by the elites at the top of society, and the other was a street movement among the masses at the bottom. There was interaction and mutual support between the two, but it's not the same thing overall. The top-level coup d'état hoped for the abdication of Nicholas II and the establishment of a responsible government under the control of the Duma. In fact, they wanted to restore the privileges of the traditional Russian aristocratic royal family, and at the same time, the emerging bourgeoisie also shared the profits. During the chaotic period of power alternation, Russia's state machinery, especially the suppression machinery, was paralyzed. The Russian Duma, which had just received the Edict of Abdication, was revolutionized by the Petrograd Soviet almost at the same time. Half of the territory was occupied by the Petrograd Soviet. However, the Petrograd Soviet was also a hodgepodge at that time. There were political parties, revolutionary parties, in the modern sense, but most of its members were representatives from lower-level communities, enterprises, and institutions, and it was not a unified whole. At that time, the Bolsheviks did not have many members, and most of them were either in exile abroad or repairing the earth in Siberia. Lenin just gave a speech in Switzerland a month ago, saying that we old people will not see the climax of the Russian Socialist Revolution coming. The first Congress of the Petrograd Soviet usurped the Taftli Palace, the office space that belonged to the State Duma. From the photos left over from that time, it can be seen that the number of people participating in the meeting in the venue was dense. In terms of form, he was more in line with the participation of the whole people in town meetings or Russian traditional autonomous organizations such as Soviets, rather than Western-style parliaments. Some people may not understand the impact of the number of participants, because the number of participants is too large, members are not fixed and come in and out at will, and a small number of security personnel cannot protect the safety of the members on the rostrum and maintain the order of the scene. The speaker on the rostrum, if you don't satisfy the audience, you can easily be pulled down and beaten up. This is different from the fake fights in parliament in the modern Western political system. After receiving the Edict of Abdication, the Special Committee of the Reich Duma, which had been triumphant and wanted to take over the power, was kicked out of its meeting place by such punches and kicks. The main turning point of the situation was the second day after the establishment of the provisional government. The Prime Minister of the provisional government, Prince Lvov, signed an order immediately after taking office to remove all the governors, mayors, governors, and other officials appointed by the Tsarist Russian government. Functions. But this kind of whimsical order cannot be put into practice at all. The Zemstvo committees are almost all talking heads, and they don't understand the actual government affairs at all, which paralyzes the entire Russian state organization and cannot function. In this context, most of the Soviets that have been established in various places are not influenced by political parties, but a natural phenomenon after the vacuum of social power. The autonomous units at the bottom took the initiative to take over power and maintain order and social operation. By the way, the Petrograd Soviet was only a local Soviet at that time, and had no superior subordinate relationship or jurisdiction over foreign Soviets. It was only after the First National Congress of Soviets that it was qualified to call itself the Central Soviet. Also suspicious. After Lenin returned to China in April, he put forward the slogan "All Power to the Soviets," which was mainly aimed at the split of the Petrograd Soviet at that time. At that time, most of the Soviet Presidium and others were revolutionary parties with intellectual backgrounds, and many westernized ideas and styles. In addition, they hook up with the provisional government, and the middle and lower level Soviet members are from local bottom level people such as community enterprises, and they are very uncomfortable with this kind of behavior. Lenin's slogan was mainly aimed at them. This kind of radicals in the middle and lower classes were overjoyed and felt that they finally had a leader, and they even called themselves Bolsheviks. From February to less than 3,000 people, the Bolshevik Party, a small party with only one seat among the 14 positions in the Petrograd Soviet Presidium, swelled to 40,000 to 50,000 people during June and July. The July mutiny was largely due to the radical soldiers' initiative to ask the Cloth Party to take over, and the Cloth Party itself was caught off guard. Although Lenin was forced to flee after the failure of the mutiny, he also saw the weakness of the provisional government and began to plan the subsequent armed seizure of power. The Constituent Assembly, which has been remembered by many people so far, is actually a replica of the Russian Gentlemen's Assembly, and it is even worse than the history of the Gentlemen's Assembly in which the real power faction participated. The provisional government has been delaying the convening of the Constituent Assembly. After the October Revolution, the Central Soviet formulated the constitution of the relevant Constituent Assembly. On the one hand, it hoped that the Constituent Assembly would establish the legitimacy of the Central Soviet. Resolution of the Soviet, otherwise the Central Soviet has the right to dissolve it. So at that time, closing down the Constituent Assembly was also legal and in line with the Constitution. As a result, it became the sailors dispersed the Constituent Assembly in the propaganda of later generations. For this reason, he was charged with violently disbanding the legal authority many years later. As for the Russian Duma, which jumped 8 feet high during the February Revolution, it disbanded itself as early as June. During the dissolution ceremony, some people spoke on stage and said that the Duma was a dead fetus that died early, and deserved to die early and be reborn. The oil painting sailors dispersed the Constituent Assembly certainly has legal and procedural problems, but as mentioned earlier, if the Speaker of the Assembly does not meet the appetite of the audience, he can be beaten out, so this method of dispersal is actually very in line with the taste and cognition of ordinary people at that time. After the October Revolution, for a considerable period of time, the actual situation was that the Soviet regime is not equal to the Bolshevik regime, and there is a difference between the two. During the Civil War, the battle cry of some white army was "Fight for the Soviet without the Buddhist Party and the Jewish Ghost." Has always claimed to be Soviet orthodoxy. This situation only improved slightly after the Civil War basically ended in 1921, when the unification was very formalized. Even some regional powers belong to the local Cloth Party headquarters, some local powers belong to the local Soviets, and some local powers are actually owned by the local Cheka. The name and reality of the Soviet. The organizational form of the Soviet can unite and mobilize the most people at the lowest cost and the fastest time, but its shortcomings are also prominent, that is, it is very difficult to make decisions, especially the coverage is too large, and it is impossible to use non-traditional methods to deal with problems. This is especially true in the era of transformational change. This is why historically the autonomous organizations in Russia must be combined with some form of unitary decision-making and executive units in order to solve this fatal weakness. During the Russian Revolution, on the one hand, the Burundi Party took advantage of the prestige and situation of the name Soviet to expand its own influence. In this process, it is inevitable to repeat the process of the struggle between the unitary decision-making core and the autonomous organization in Russian history. It is against this background that the words and deeds of the entire Cloth Party during the Russian Revolution were extremely contradictory, which puzzled and debated countless generations. Simply put, this contradiction means that the Budak Party must speak the most democratic words and do the most dictatorial things. It is also the complexity and cognitive level of the Russian Soviet itself that led to differences in understanding of the Burundian Party and the Russian Revolution, because it cannot be fully described by European political languages and theories within the same framework. It may be that many blind people touch the elephant, and chickens, and ducks talk. Faced with the situation at that time, the Bubu Party could only consciously or unconsciously take some measures to solve these problems voluntarily or forcibly. The first of which is to deify Lenin infinitely and even create a new god against Lenin's own wishes. This is deification in the true sense. In some places, the portrait of Lenin is even treated as a substitute for the Orthodox icon. After the Tsarist Russian general defected to the Buddhist party, he saw Lenin crying and knelt down to kiss his fingers. It is estimated that it has nothing to do with feeling the call of new political ideas. The second is to strengthen the construction of the party organization. The central government sends to various places to establish party headquarters, and supports party members to take up major positions in the local Soviets, so as to ensure that the local Soviets cannot pass decisions that violate the party organization. In fact, it is similar to the restriction of the Constituent Assembly by the resolution of the Soviet mentioned above. Of course, during the Civil War, and throughout the 1920s, there was a complex situation of struggle and cooperation between the local party organizations and the Soviets, and the status and authority of the party were not so unquestionable. If the first two are easy to understand and more in line with general cognition, then the third is a bit more complicated and has a far-reaching impact. On October 27, 1917, shortly after the October Revolution, the Central Soviet passed a resolution to establish the People's Committee as the executive body of the Soviet organization, which was the prototype and predecessor of the Soviet government. This does not seem to be a problem, but if you look at the Russian language, the name of this institution is also called Soviet of the People's Commissars. Although in the early days it was indeed attempted to use the Soviet model of equal rights consultation to form a modern government agency, the practice that ministers could slap the table at any time if they disagreed was really neither suitable for the modern industrialized society, nor adapted to the internal and external difficulties at that time. The status quo of Soviet Russia. Ideas can only bow their heads in the face of reality, and the Soviets of the People's Commissars can only quickly become professional bureaucrats. Although the bureaucratization of the Bubu Party has always been an enduring topic, the actual situation is far beyond the imagination of future generations. The bureaucratization of the Soviet government was not even a spontaneous bureaucratic organization as originally mentioned, and Stalin was blamed. The bureaucratization of the Soviet government originated from the appointment of a large number of bureaucrats from the former Tsarist Russian government. By the end of the Civil War, 60 to 80% of the members of the various ministries and commissions of the Soviet government were employees of the former Tsarist Russian government, and in some departments it was as high as 90%. A large number of former Tsarist Russian bureaucrats who were familiar with government affairs joined the Soviet regime. On the one hand, it also ensured that the emerging government could barely manipulate the complex modern state machinery and industrial society, and maintain internal affairs and logistics. In contrast, the White Army had no one to do these jobs for them, so they had to either rob or seek loans from foreign governments, and finally became white bandits. As for why the Tsarist Russian bureaucrats would rather collectively join the Cloth Party than work for the White Army, it is another complicated topic, which is beyond the scope of this article. However, the price of the gift of fate has long been secretly marked. Such a large-scale appointment of old bureaucrats has caused an uproar and fierce backlash within the party. From the end of 1919 to the beginning of 1920, Slepnikov, one of the veterans of the Burundi Party, led the members of the party who were born at the bottom of the party to challenge the Central Committee of the Burundi Party and demand that it hand over its jurisdiction over economic issues. The famous workers' opposition movement in history. This event had a great impact at the time, but it was rarely seen in the annals of history in later generations, and not many people knew about it. Most of the enterprise workers in Moscow and Petrograd supported the workers' opposition, and held large-scale demonstrations, strikes, and organized workers' arms. It was against this background that the Kronstadt Mutiny broke out. Faced with this crisis, the workers' opposition was forced to make concessions and was finally disbanded and marginalized. The Central Committee of the Burundi Party also made certain adjustments and compromises. One of the major crimes cited by the workers' opposition at the time was that the Central Committee of the Burundi Party used a large number of bureaucrats from former Tsarist Russia. If the impact of the workers' opposition was limited to the entire 1920s, then another impact lasted throughout the history of the Soviet Union, that is, the name of the Soviet regime does not match its reality. As mentioned earlier, the Soviet institution, whether it is the Russian tradition or the early concept of the Revolutionary Party, is an institution of affirmative consultation, and the trinity of legislation, law enforcement, and administration, such as Makhno, who is known as anarchist. Adherents of this concept. However, this kind of organization is actually very difficult to implement in modern industrial society. In fact, it is difficult to implement in agricultural society. Earlier, only Russia's special historical and geographical reasons preserved it. After the People's Commissars Soviet was established, in order to further strengthen the centralization of power, the actual power of the Central Soviet was transferred to this institution to a considerable extent, because they were all called Soviets, which caused great conceptual confusion in the later history of the Soviet Union. What is the so-called Soviet regime referring to? Is affirmative action consultation a trinity institution of legislation, law enforcement, and administration at the same time? Is it a legislative assembly in the sense of modern political theory? Or a government of professional bureaucrats? Then on April 1, 1918, Svetlov unabashedly called the Soviet of People's Commissars an authority that combined legislative, executive, and administrative powers. No matter at that time or in later generations, it was unreasonable in terms of concept and tradition. It was a typical change of position, but this practice was retained for various reasons. However, this approach was generally not accepted at the time, especially among the local independent Soviet organizations, so it is not surprising why there were a large number of Soviet organizations without the Buletin Party and Jewish ghosts during the Soviet-Russian Civil War. The Jewish ghost here refers to Svetlov and his Jewish commissioners. For ease of understanding, it can be compared to a war between different Soviets. Yakov Svetlov, the most capable cadre of the Bolshevik Party before and after the October Revolution, had even more influence than Trotsky. Died untimely in March 1919. The cause of death has always been different. One of the versions is that when he gave a speech to the workers in the field, he asked the workers to continue to endure the difficulties of lack of supplies and save supplies to support the world revolution. He was beaten by the enraged workers and seriously injured. Because of his preference for black clothes, he was called the Revolutionary Black Devil by the enemies of the Buddhist Party, both in life and after death, so Trotsky earned the nickname Revolutionary Goblin. Well, this kind of local/grassroots Soviets and the top institutions of the country controlled by the Buddhist Party have always had various differences in ideas, interests, and goals. Except for a few goals, most of them are diametrically opposed to each other. Here is a typical example. At the beginning of October 1920, the number of the Soviet Red Army was almost 5.5 million. In the Battle of Warsaw that broke out in August of the same year, the number of the Red Army did not exceed 200,000. At this time, most of the established White Army in Russia had been wiped out, but not many troops participated in the Polish campaign, which was regarded as an important part of the world revolution by the top leaders of the Budapest Party. This is also unreasonable under the traditional view of cloth party history, but it may be easier to understand if you make an analogy, that is, during the American Revolutionary War, the various troops in the United States were actually the troops of the state, not the Continental Congress and even Washington. Similarly, the Red Army has a large number of people, but they are all influenced by the local area. They don't know much about the world revolution and have no interest in it, so they can't be mobilized. In the same way, according to the thinking of the Chinese, it is difficult to understand why Trotsky, the father of the Red Army, was defeated in politics. It is because most of the Red Army actually have no interest in the father of the Red Army. It is more likely to rely on the army to be served by ice picks in advance. The Soviet movie Xiaobo Yang, released in 1936, is considered to be the origin of Gao Dequan's artistic image. Xiaobo Yang couldn't tell the difference, so he had to say that I followed Lenin, and I would support whoever Lenin was on. It is conceivable that the actual situation at the time was much different than what was shown in the movie. Stills of Xiaobo Yang. Throughout the 1920s, this kind of conflict between local/grassroots Soviet representatives and the capital Soviet high level can be seen at any time. Top Soviets: we must tolerate religion. Grassroots representatives: smash churches, kill priests. High Soviets: our new economic policy is a temporary measure. Grassroots representatives: these are traitors who sneaked in to sabotage. High-ranking Soviets: Russian language is the embodiment of chauvinism, and Pushkin is a noble son of a bitch. Grassroots representative: believe it or not, we smashed your dog's head on the spot. It was these contradictions and conflicts that could be seen everywhere in the 1920s that led to the political turmoil throughout the Soviet Union in the 1920s and 1930s. Compared with them, the theoretical debates at the top were a kind of teacup storm. Now quite a few people complacently feel that they have caught a loophole in Stalin's theory, or are vacillating from side to side. In fact, Stalin also swayed with his voters, that is, cadre groups and Soviet representatives from the traditional central industrial areas of Russia, so as to gain their support in order to take power. Of course, many people have been misled by Stalin's title of General Secretary of the party all the year round. In fact, General Secretary and Secretary General are the same word in Russian, and the Secretary General of the United Nations can also be called the General Secretary of the United Nations. According to the content of Stalin's early duties, it is more appropriate to be translated as Secretary General. The main job content is to arrange for people to print and distribute the content of the meeting after the Politburo meeting. It is not even possible to control whether it is implemented. The appointment and dismissal of personnel that the guys regard as unimportant chores. As for Lenin's will as evidence of unlimited power, there is a high possibility that it was forged. This situation lasted until the end of the 1920s. There have been many discussions on the economic and industrial needs of Soviet collectivization and industrialization, but political considerations have rarely been mentioned. In other words, the process of Soviet collectivization and industrialization was actually the need and process of Soviet centralization. It was also during this process that the local party committees of the Bubu party gained actual ruling power, and the central government also strengthened its ruling power and discourse power. But this is not the end of the problem, but the beginning of the next round of troubles, because at that time, the main way to expand the number of party members into the party, since the original local powers were sent to the party, and therefore they had to be directed by the party committee to carry out mild embezzlement. But this method also comes at a price, that is, the past non-party contradictions have evolved into intra-party contradictions. The political turmoil in the Soviet Union throughout the 1930s became more intense and serious, and it was not until the Great Purge that it came to an end again. Of course, the content related to this article is actually the political status of the Soviet organization in the traditional concept has plummeted. At this time, the Soviet regime is mentioned, and most of the cases refer to the Soviet government composed of professional bureaucrats. At the end of the 1930s, the Soviet Union revised its constitution and confirmed the Supreme Soviet as the highest organ of power in the Soviet Union. But at this time, the Supreme Soviet was no different from the legislature in the modern political sense, at least formally eliminating the historical Soviet tradition and modern political power. Conflict between theories. Of course, in the late 1930s, there was a last echo of the traditional Soviets. The 1936 Soviet constitutional reform called for the reduction of the role of the CPSU party committee in managing state affairs, and the strengthening of the role of the Soviet regime and the implementation of differential voting. In fact, this sent a wrong signal, causing the Soviet local governments and traditional Soviet organizations to think that their good days were coming, and they were ready to seize power immediately. Of course, the party committee was unwilling to give up the leadership that took nearly 20 years to seize, and immediately the Soviet Union was caught in a bloodbath, which was also a major reason for the outbreak of the Great Purge in the Soviet Union. Although it is said that Ivalgi has described the Great Purge as Stalin's personal spiritual problem since then, it is pure nonsense, but Stalin himself presided over the compilation of a brief history of the Buddhist Party, which created the history view of the Buddhist Party and put the ideological correctness in command. Under the narrative of historical outlook, the following series of political struggles can only be sabotaged by someone. When Stalin was alive, he asked Trotsky to carry it. When he was gone, he had to carry it himself. Defeated Soviet. In 1939, after the Great Purge, Stalin once again issued a call to reduce the role of the party committee in managing state affairs and to strengthen the role of the Soviet regime. Here it is clearly stated that the Soviet regime refers to the Soviet of People's Commissars, which is the Soviet government. For a long time after that, the political life of the Soviet Union mainly revolved around the power struggle between the party committee and the government. It is mentioned in Rotten Slush. As an organization, the role of the Soviet was changed to sending representatives to participate in the meeting, which was later known as warm applause, instead of preparing to rush to the rostrum to break the dog's head of so-and-so. But in the field of propaganda, in people's memory, in the narration of ideology, and in the dissemination of the party's historical view, the Soviet Organization of Equal Rights Consultation is still the source of the legitimacy of the Soviet regime, representing the greatest political correctness, and becoming the Soviet Union together with Lenin. Unalterable ancestral law. On the other hand, the Soviet organization has been continuously reborn in history, which means that this form and concept are in line with Russia's national conditions and people's cognition. After the Soviet organization was excluded from the Soviet political process, of course there was no political struggle and instability that resulted, but it also lost the strong mobilization ability and enthusiasm of the participants. After the 1950s, Soviet society became more and more decadent, lacking motivation, and the organization was disorganized and paralyzed. It has to be said that it has a lot to do with the fact that the Soviet name does not match its reality. Time flies, and in 1988, Gorbachev, whose power was limited under the suppression of the two major systems of the party and the government, thought of a smart trick in order to find a new power support point for himself. This genius idea was restore Soviet orthodoxy, and then use this Orthodox Soviet to endorse yourself, bypass the two sets of Soviet party and government teams, give legitimacy to the power to establish new institutions and positions, and rebuild the power framework of the Soviet Union. Then the way to restore Soviet orthodoxy is of course to hold a referendum to elect people's representatives, and the elected people's representatives will form a new Supreme Soviet. The new Soviet will set up the position of the President of the Soviet Union, and Lao Ge can seamlessly connect, serve as the President of the Soviet Union and then issue orders in this name. Well, you can't blame Lao Ge for his naivete. After all, he has been educated by the Buletin Party's view of history for so many years. The badass Lao Ge, who is good at power struggles within the party but seriously lacks grassroots training and local work experience, may have never thought about the difference between the masses guided by revolutionary ideas and populism driven by interests, and what kind of beast he will unleash. In the Soviet election in 1989, the whole thing was a riot of demons, and all kinds of idlers and other speculators jumped out. I won't describe the specific process. Yeltsin, who was already a political corpse, was resurrected in situ. If the pattern formed by the Soviet party and government system was followed, Yeltsin at this time has no political future at all, and he himself is also half hidden. Retired and wrote open letters within the party to review and apologize over and over again. The immaturity of Soviet politics and its supporting square politics was fully reflected in this election. Various myths about Yeltsin continued to spread among the entire Moscow public, and the last rumors were all kinds of weird, but it made him become the savior in the hearts of the people. Of course, this was so stupid that most people wanted to forget it, so people generally remembered that Yeltsin was a big alcoholic who brought disaster to the country and the people, but they didn't remember that they personally lifted him to the altar. During that time, Moscow continuously launched hundreds of thousands of people to take to the streets to support Yeltsin's rallies. In the end, he was elected as the representative of the people of Moscow with 92% of the votes. More than 80% of the adults in the city supported him. Slogan: Yeltsin, the people's candidate. Another familiar formula, familiar taste. The mass support for Yeltsin has become a dark history that Moscow residents do not want to recall in the future. Fortunately, I just bent my knees and kissed my fingers instead of kneeling down. The times are still progressing, but a bit slower. With such a huge popular support, many people were affected consciously or unconsciously. Even in the top Soviet Union, many people began to bet on Yeltsin. Yeltsin was successfully elected as a people's representative and was able to arrive at the venue to participate in the Congress. What's even more outrageous is that Gorbachev and others originally thought that since there was no way to stop Yeltsin, let Yeltsin be an ordinary member of parliament. However, when the General Assembly elected the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet and should announce the closure of the Supreme Soviet, there was a Supreme Soviet. Members of the Bureau publicly stated that the election was unfair, and demanded in front of Gorbachev to transfer their status as members of the Bureau to Yeltsin. Under the watchful eyes of everyone, Gorbachev was caught off guard and could only agree. If it was within the established party and government system of the Soviet Union at that time, such a big accident would not have happened, but as an organization of equal rights consultation, it is very common for such things to happen in the Soviet Union. In the second year, Lao Ge had no memory and was happy to organize the elections of local people's representatives in each Union Republic, as well as the local Soviet representatives elected by him. Now the devil was completely released, and the Soviets all over the country immediately became the headquarters of the national split and crusade against the two sets of Soviet party and government groups. Yeltsin was also successfully re-elected as the people's representative of the Russian Soviet Republic. After becoming the chairman of the Supreme Soviet of the Russian Soviet Republic, he became the president of the Russian Soviet Republic as a matter of course after the establishment of the presidency. Let me emphasize again that the Soviet was originally an institution with three powers in one, and the head of the Supreme Soviet should have the status of the chief executive. The same thing happened in other republics. After that, each Union Republic had an independent legislative and administrative agency, and the party and government agencies that had been the maintainers of the Soviet Union for a long time became rats in the street and were hammered by thousands of people. Then the republics could not agree on the terms of cooperation and separated. It's a matter of time remaining. People have been asking/joking about why the people didn't come out to defend the Soviet Union at the end of the Soviet Union. In fact, being able to ask this question is also a victim of the Bulletin Party's view of history. It was the Supreme Soviet that led everyone to split, so what kind of Soviet should we defend? This is another civil war between different Soviets, and isn't the new leader justifiably better than the bald guy who won't let everyone drink? The reason why the Soviet Union disintegrated so suddenly was that the economic factor was secondary, and the most deadly reason was the inherent contradiction in the design of the political system, that is, the problem of state construction. Not the end. The dream will eventually wake up. After the disintegration of the Soviet Union, the cold political and economic reality threw the former republics into the abyss, and the people finally paid the price for their fanaticism and naivete. As in 1937, the Soviet organization finally left its last echoes before retreating. The Supreme Soviet of the Russian Federation, which has been supporting Yeltsin for a long time, is right. The institution translated as the Russian Federation Parliament is actually the Supreme Soviet that has continued since the end of the Soviet Union. If differences in the economic sphere are not taken into account, then there are great differences between the two regarding the future state structure of the Russian Federation. On the one hand, the idea is that the Supreme Soviet appoints the president, controls the government, and continues to maintain the framework of the past tripartite organization, while on the other hand, it is to establish a super-presidential republic, and the parliament learns from Western countries and is only responsible for legislative issues. This controversy was ended in the rumble of gunfire in October 1993. The organizational form of the Soviet also disappeared from the legal level in Russia. This event was called bombing the White House in history. The death toll is still debated. There are various theories ranging from dozens of casualties to the fact that the stadium was filled with dead people, and many Chinese watched the process as people who didn't know the truth. But later this incident was often described as the parliament wanting to restore the Soviet Union. This was the final decisive battle between liberalism and communism. In fact, the bombarded parliament was the biggest gravedigger in the Soviet Union. It can only be said that the retribution is bad. The building of the Supreme Soviet under shelling. Political enthusiasm comes and goes quickly, and without the crowds of supporters in the square, the naked Supreme Soviet is just another constituent assembly waiting to be dispersed. The most mysterious incident during the bombardment of the White House in 1993 was that its most staunch supporters turned out to be the Russian royalists who had just surfaced at that time. The world's icon fiercely confronted Yeltsin's troops in front of the White House. The next time these two flags were raised simultaneously in the same camp was many years later during the Eastern Ukraine War. Alexander Borodin, a member of the famous Russian Royalist Party. In 1993, he commanded the Royalist Fighting Organization to fight to the last moment in the White House Square, and escaped with people after the Supreme Soviet energized and surrendered. During the Eastern Ukrainian War in 2014, he served as the chairman of the Soviet of Ministers of the Donetsk Republic. The current chairman of the Donbass Volunteer Association has a lot of private cooperation with Russian officials. In 2021, when this article was written, he passed the party pre-election in the Duma election of the United Russia Party, and was later elected as a member of the lower house. He was also the vice chairman of the Duma Foreign Affairs Committee. After that, the Soviet as a political organization disappeared at the national level in Russia, and the new upper and lower parliaments have imitated the institutional design of Western countries. Let me say a digression here, which involves Lauye's historical evaluation. In the past, Lauye had two historical evaluations. One was the drunkard, national traitor, bastard. The other is the evaluation of the liberals. He brought light, freedom, and happiness to Russia. The Yeltsin Memorial Hall, which was built at a cost of $5 billion, has such contents. This is pure nonsense. In recent years, a third voice has appeared one after another, that is, Yeltsin, as a politician, made many mistakes and sins, but he still made 4 major achievements for Russia that cannot be completely erased. The second of these 4 achievements is the resolute decision to bombard the White House in 1993, which systematically eliminated the unstable factors in the design of Russia's national regime. The third is that the 1993 Constitution established Russia as a super-presidential country. The fourth credit is the launch of the First Chechen War in 1994. Although the process was embarrassing, it prevented the further disintegration of the Russian state. Of course, many people know that the number one achievement, and it has long been regarded as Yeltsin's only achievement, is to elect Putin as his successor. So can it be said that the Soviets have disappeared in Russia? It can only be said that as a political heritage, the name Soviets has been completely linked to the left-wing movement, and they are the only ones who will continue to fly this banner. But as mentioned earlier, the organizational form of affirmative action accords with Russia's traditions and historical conditions, and it will continue to exist for a long time. To a considerable extent, the United Russia Party established before and after Putin came to power, the name was changed several times in the middle, don't pay too much attention to it, is neither an electoral party in the modern Western sense nor an ideological party in the Lenin sense, but a national political party in Russia. The coalition of powerful factions in various places, its organizational form is largely the same as the model of equal rights negotiation, and it was not until 2016 that with the continuous consolidation of Putin's regime, it gradually declined into an executive organization. And this form of self-organization has been renamed, such as a committee, a coalition, or something else, and it still exists in all aspects of Russia, whether it is political or civil. For example, this year's freshly released political party is composed of just Russia, for the Truth and Patriotic Party. In short, understanding the special organizational form of the Soviet is the key to understanding Russia's historical present and future.